I swear on my life something is wrong with that road, and Ranger knows it. Ethan Carter stood at the edge of the quiet tree-lined street, staring at the pavement like it might rise up and bite him. His German shepherd, Ranger, sat beside him, ears perked, his muscular frame as still as stone. Ranger's fur bristled along his back, a deep growl rumbling in his throat. No matter how many times Ethan tried to walk across that road, Ranger refused. Ethan had lived in Pine Hollow his whole life. It was a kind of town where nothing ever seemed out of place. People waved from their porches, kids rode their bikes past neatly trimmed lawns, and the local diner still had the same waitress from 30 years ago. But right now, something about this street made the hairs on Ethan's arms stand up. And if Ranger, the most fearless dog he'd ever known, refused to cross it, then there had to be a reason. It all started 3 weeks ago. Ethan had been out for his usual morning walk with Ranger, cutting through the side streets like always. When they reached the corner of Maple and Ridgeway, Ranger froze. His tail stiffened, his ears went back, and he let out a low, warning growl. Ethan gave the leash a gentle tug, but Ranger planted his paws and wouldn't budge. "Come on, buddy. It's just a road. We cross here all the time," Ethan said. But Ranger didn't move. His amber eyes locked onto something Ethan couldn't see, his chest rising and falling in short, uneasy breaths. "All right, fine. We'll go around," Ethan muttered, steering Ranger down another street. He thought it was just a fluke. Maybe a squirrel had darted across the road, or a strange scent spooked him. But the next day, and the day after that, Ranger reacted the exact same way. Every time they reached that corner, his whole body tensed, and he refused to take a step forward. Ethan tried everything: treats, commands, walking ahead first. Nothing worked. Ranger wouldn't cross Maple and Ridgeway. Curiosity got the better of Ethan. He started asking around. Most folks in town just shrugged. "Probably just a weird smell," Mrs. Turner from next door had said. "You know how dogs are. Maybe a raccoon got hit there, and the scent is sticking around," suggested Rob, the guy who owned the hardware store. But then Ethan spoke to Old Man Collins. The retired school teacher had lived in Pine Hollow longer than anyone, and when Ethan mentioned Ranger's odd behavior, Collins' wrinkled face grew serious. "That road," Collins said, leaning in as if someone might be listening, "ain't normal. Never has been." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Collins rubbed his jaw. "Strange things happen there. Dogs don't go near it. People say they get this feeling, like they're being watched. And some folks, well, they've had worse luck." Ethan felt a chill roll through him. "Worse luck?" Collins nodded. "Accidents, disappearances. More than a few cars have gone off the road right there, and no one knows why. Good people just gone." Ethan tried to shake it off. It sounded like small-town superstition. But something about the way Ranger stood firm, his body tense like he was guarding against something unseen, made Ethan uneasy. He wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories, but he trusted Ranger more than anyone, and Ranger was terrified of that road. That night, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about it. He sat on his porch, Ranger resting at his feet, while the summer wind carried the scent of pine and warm asphalt. He thought about the way Ranger had reacted, the way Old Man Collins had spoken in that hushed, knowing voice. Something was off, and Ethan needed to find out what it was. The next morning, he made a plan. He'd go to Maple and Ridgeway alone. No leash, no ranger. He'd walk across that street, stand in the middle, and prove to himself that nothing was there. When he reached the intersection, the town was quiet. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the pavement. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward. A sudden wave of nausea hit him. His chest tightened. His vision blurred for just a second, like a pressure had wrapped around his skull. The world seemed wrong. He shook his head, trying to clear it, and took another step. The air felt heavy, thick, like he was wading through something unseen. The distant hum of cicadas seemed to fade, replaced by a sound that sent a shiver down his spine, a low, whispering voice just at the edge of his hearing. Ethan stumbled back, his heart pounding. The moment his foot hit the curb, the feeling vanished. The air lightened. The world returned to normal. Ranger was right. Something was very, very wrong with that road. Ethan turned on his heel and walked away, his mind racing. If something unnatural was at that intersection, he needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start. Old Man Collins had told him about the disappearances, the accidents, but there had to be more. Records, newspaper clippings, something to explain why Ranger refused to cross that road. Ethan spent the rest of the day at the Pine Hollow Library, poring over old newspapers and town records. He half expected to find nothing, just eerie stories passed down through generations, something that had taken on a life of its own. But the more he read, the more he realized that Collins hadn't been exaggerating. The accidents at Maple and Ridgeway weren't just rumors. They were real. The first recorded incident dated back to 1952. A local farmer named Dale Whitaker had been found lying in the middle of the intersection, his truck abandoned on the side of the road. No injuries, no sign of struggle. He couldn't remember how he got there. The doctors chalked it up to exhaustion. But Dale insisted that he had seen something, a shadow moving across the road right before he blacked out. More cases followed. In 1968, a teenage girl disappeared while walking home from the diner. Her footprints led straight to the center of the road and then vanished. Her family searched for weeks, but she was never found. In 1985, a delivery driver lost control of his truck at the same spot. He survived the crash, but was never the same again. People said he woke up screaming in the middle of the night, talking about something watching him from the trees. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling. The list went on. No two incidents were exactly the same, but they all happened at Maple and Ridgeway, and there was one detail that kept coming up over and over. Dogs refused to go near the place. It was in the records, buried in witness statements and police reports. Dogs had pulled against leashes, whined, barked, or run in the opposite direction, just like Ranger. That night, Ethan decided he needed to see Maple and Ridgeway at night. Maybe it was crazy, but he wanted to know if the feeling was stronger in the dark. He grabbed a flashlight, his old camping knife, and Ranger's leash. The dog wouldn't cross the street, but Ethan still wanted him close. He had never ignored Ranger's instincts before, and he wasn't about to start now. By the time he reached the intersection, the town was asleep. The street was quiet, the only sound the occasional chirp of crickets. Ethan clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. He took a deep breath, stepping forward. The moment his foot touched the asphalt, that same pressure wrapped around him. A weight settled on his chest, heavy and suffocating. The sound of cicadas vanished, replaced by an eerie silence. Ranger let out a low, warning growl from the sidewalk. Ethan forced himself to take another step. His heart pounded in his chest. The air felt thick, like he was moving through molasses. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the empty road. Then he heard it. A whisper. Not words, not exactly. More like a breath, a sigh, carried on the wind. The flashlight flickered. Ethan's pulse jumped. He tightened his grip on the handle, his skin cold despite the warm night air. Ranger barked, sharp, loud, urgent. The whispering stopped. Ethan's breath came in short gasps. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to stay. He had come here for answers. He wasn't leaving without something. He crouched down, running his fingers along the road surface. It felt normal. Rough pavement, a few cracks, nothing strange. Then his fingers brushed something cool, smooth. He angled the flashlight down. His stomach clenched. A locket. It was small, old, the gold chain tangled. He picked it up carefully, holding it in his palm. The metal was cool despite the heat of the night. He flicked it open. Inside was a faded photograph. A young woman smiling, her dark hair pulled back. On the other side of the locket, a name was engraved. Vivian Parker. The next morning, Ethan headed straight to the library. The name nagged at him, tickling the back of his mind like an old memory just out of reach. He searched the archives, flipping through old newspapers, until he found it. Vivian Parker, the girl who disappeared in 1968. Ethan's pulse quickened. The article was yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the story was clear. Vivian had been walking home from the diner late one evening. She was last seen at Maple and Ridgeway. Her footprints led to the center of the road. Then, nothing. Her body was never found. Ethan leaned back, exhaling. He had found her locket. After all these years, it had been sitting there, waiting. But for what? Ranger had known something was wrong. The other dogs before him had known. And now, Ethan knew too. Vivian Parker had never really left. That night, Ethan and George, Vivian's brother, returned to the intersection. The air shifted as they stepped onto the road. The night went silent. Ethan felt it again, that pressure, that weight on his chest. Ranger let out a low whine, his tail stiff, and then, just at the edge of the light, something moved. Not a person, not an animal, a shadow shifting, watching. Ethan's breath caught. George gripped the locket in his hand. Vivian? The whisper returned, curling through the air. A breath, a sigh. Then, just for a moment, Ethan thought he saw her, a figure standing in the darkness. A girl with dark hair, her eyes wide with something between fear and hope. Then she was gone. The night held its breath, and Ethan knew deep in his bones that the mystery of Maple and Ridgeway was only just beginning. The priest nodded solemnly, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. Be careful, Ethan. Some things don't like being disturbed. Ethan wasn't sure if he believed in ghosts, but he did believe in unfinished business, and Vivian's story wasn't over yet. The morning sun had barely started to rise when Ethan and George returned to Maple and Ridgeway. The air was still, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The town remained asleep, unaware of what they were about to do. Ranger walked at Ethan's side, his nose twitching at the ground, his ears up and alert. He wasn't growling this time, but his entire body remained tense. He could sense something was different. Ethan parked the truck a short distance away, his fingers tightening on the wheel, before he let out a slow breath. "We're doing this now, before we start second-guessing ourselves." George nodded, his gaze locked on the intersection. "If Vivian's still here, we need to find out why." Ethan grabbed his flashlight and the map they had found, the one marking the cemetery that used to be here. The paper was fragile, its corners worn, but it showed exactly what they needed to see. According to the records, the cemetery had been small, just over 24 graves. But no one could say for sure if every body had been moved when the land was repurposed. Given the history of accidents and disappearances, Ethan had a sinking feeling that something had been left behind. "Let's start with the old boundary lines," Ethan said, tracing a finger over the map. "If any of the original graves were missed, they'd be somewhere around here." George pulled in a slow breath, adjusting his grip on the locket in his hand. He hadn't let it go since Ethan had given it to him. "You really think we'll find something?" Ethan glanced at Ranger, who sniffed at the pavement but refused to step forward. "I think Ranger knows we will." They worked their way around the intersection, following the layout of the old cemetery as best they could. Ethan checked the ground for any inconsistencies, discolored patches of dirt, shifts in the pavement, anything that suggested something was buried beneath. It wasn't an exact science, but they had to start somewhere. An hour passed, with no results. The sun crept higher, casting long shadows. Ethan was starting to think they might need to dig deeper, maybe even find someone who could get them access to city plans, when Ranger suddenly stopped. His nose pressed against the ground near a patch of grass growing along the edge of the road. Ethan stepped closer. "What is it, boy?" Ranger sniffed again, then looked up at Ethan with an expression that made his stomach twist. Ethan knelt and pressed his palm against the grass. The dirt here was softer than it should have been. His pulse kicked up. "George, come look at this." George crouched beside him. "What are we looking at?" Ethan moved the grass aside, revealing a small section of disturbed earth. It looked almost like something had been dug up before, recently. Ethan exchanged a glance with George before pulling out his pocket knife and pressing it into the dirt. It sank in easily. "The ground's loose," Ethan murmured. "Someone's been here before." Before George could finish his sentence, a gust of wind swept through the intersection, sudden and sharp. The air turned cold, the same unnatural stillness pressing in on them. Ranger let out a soft whimper and backed up, his body low to the ground. Ethan swallowed hard. "We're not alone." George clutched the locket. "Vivian, if this is you, we're listening." The air grew heavier. The trees lining the road swayed without a breeze, and then, in the silence, came the sound of footsteps. Soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. Ethan turned sharply, scanning the area with his flashlight, but there was no one there. George's breathing turned shallow. "Ethan, look!" Ethan followed his gaze and felt his throat tighten. The ground where they had just been investigating was shifting. The dirt trembled, small pieces of grass lifting as if something beneath was pushing up. Ranger barked, snapping at the air, but Ethan barely noticed. He reached for George's arm, pulling him back. "Step away." The earth continued to shift, Then slowly, impossibly, something began to rise from the dirt. A shape, long buried but not forgotten. Ethan's heart pounded as the outline of a wooden box became clear. "It's a coffin," George whispered. Ethan could barely breathe. The wood was old, rotted in places, the nails rusted. It had been underground for decades, yet here it was, forcing its way to the surface. The realization hit him like a truck. This grave had never been moved. George's voice broke. "Vivian, this is you, isn't it?" The air pulsed, an unseen force pressing against them. Ethan clenched his jaw and forced himself forward, brushing dirt away from the top of the coffin. The wood was cracked, but through the gaps he could see something inside. Fabric, a dress, faded and torn with age, a skeletal hand resting gently over it. Ethan's chest tightened. She was here the whole time. George's face was unreadable, his hands gripping the locket so tightly his knuckles turned white. They never moved her. They just paved over the cemetery and left her here all these years. She was alone. Ranger sat silently beside them, his head bowed slightly, as if he understood what they had uncovered. Ethan exhaled a deep, shuddering breath. This is why she never left. She was waiting for someone to find her. George wiped at his eyes before nodding. Then let's make sure she's finally put to rest the right way. They called the authorities. It was a long process. Police, forensic teams, historians digging into the records. The town was shaken by the discovery, the truth about Maple and Ridgeway finally coming to light. The cemetery had been forgotten, but Vivian had never truly left. Days later, she was properly laid to rest, this time with her family beside her. Ethan stood next to George at the gravesite, watching as they lowered the casket, this time in a proper burial ground. The weight that had hung over the intersection for decades seemed to lift, the air feeling lighter than it had in years. Even Ranger, who had always refused to go near that road, sat calmly at Ethan's side, his tail flicking once against the grass. George let out a slow breath, his fingers brushing over the locket once more before he stepped forward and placed it on the grave. "She's home now?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, she is." As they turned to leave, a gentle breeze swept through the trees, carrying a soft whisper with it, not of fear, not of pain, but of peace. Ethan sat on his porch that evening, Ranger stretched out beside him, eyes half closed, but still alert. The past few days had been a whirlwind. Between the discovery of Vivian's resting place, the investigation, and the weight of everything they had uncovered, he hadn't had much time to process it all. But now, as the sky turned deep shades of orange and purple, the town seemingly settling into its quiet rhythm again, he finally let himself breathe. George had gone home after the burial, a quiet goodbye exchanged between them. Ethan knew the man needed time. He had spent most of his life wondering what happened to his sister, and now, after all these years, he finally had an answer. But answers didn't erase the pain. They only made it easier to carry. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, glancing down at Ranger. "You knew something was wrong before any of us did. Guess I should have listened sooner." Ranger let out a soft huff, his tail flicking slightly. Ethan reached down, scratching behind his ears. "You still won't cross that road, though, will you? Even after everything?" The dog's ears twitched, and though he didn't respond in the way Ethan expected, He could tell there was still something about Maple and Ridgeway that unsettled him. Maybe Vivian had been put to rest, but something still lingered. Ethan could feel it too, like an echo of the past, refusing to fully let go. Ethan leaned back, staring up at the sky. He wasn't a man who easily believed in things beyond his understanding, but he had no choice now. He had seen too much, felt too much, and the question still nagged at him. Why had this all happened now? Vivian had been there for decades, forgotten beneath the pavement, and yet it was only now that she had made her presence known. Why? Ethan exhaled, pushing himself up from his chair. "Come on, Ranger, let's take a walk." The German shepherd stretched, then trotted to his side, ready as always. Ethan didn't head toward Maple and Ridgeway. He knew better than to push Ranger into something he wasn't ready for. But he did take a slow walk through town, his thoughts churning. The streetlights flickered on as he passed, casting long, soft glows against the sidewalks. Pine Hollow was a quiet place, the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, where everyone knew each other's names. But it had its secrets. He knew that now more than ever. He found himself walking toward the library. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was unfinished business. Either way, he pushed open the door and was met with the familiar scent of old books and worn wood. Martha looked up from her desk, her sharp gaze softening when she saw him. "Back so soon, Ethan?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. "Couldn't stay away," he admitted, stepping forward. "I've been thinking about something. Something tells me you're not quite done with this mystery yet." She nodded knowingly. Vivian was found. She was buried properly, but I can't shake the feeling that there is more to it. Something else happened on that road. Something that started all of this. I need to know why it waited until now to be discovered. Martha studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then let's find out." She led him toward the archives again, the same dusty shelves they had dug through before. Ethan sat at one of the tables as she pulled out a different set of files. This time, one's not just about Maple and Ridgeway, but about the history of Pine Hollow itself. "This town is older than most people realize," she said as she set the books down. "It's changed a lot over the years, and not all of that change was clean or easy. There were decisions made that people don't talk about anymore. But the past has a way of surfacing, especially when it's been buried." Ethan flipped open the first book, scanning through pages of old records, faded photographs, and handwritten notes. Pine Hollow had once been a much smaller settlement, growing rapidly when the railway expanded nearby. There were stories of land disputes, families forced to move, and, just as Father Murphy had told him, records of cemeteries being repurposed. Then, near the back of the book, he found something that made his breath catch. A ledger dated 1922, listing names of those buried at Blackwood Cemetery, names that had supposedly been relocated, except 2 names were crossed out. Ethan traced his finger over the ink. Vivian wasn't the only one. Martha leaned over, adjusting her glasses. "That can't be right. This list was supposed to be a complete record of the cemetery before the land was developed. If names were crossed out, it means someone tried to erase them." Ethan's stomach turned. Who else was left behind? He flipped through more pages, searching for any mention of the names. It wasn't easy. Whoever had done this had made sure there was almost nothing left. But then, tucked between old building permits and land deeds, he found something, a single newspaper clipping, barely held together at the edges. It was dated 3 years before Vivian disappeared. Ethan scanned the article, his pulse quickening. The man's name was Thomas Whitaker, a laborer part of the team that had been responsible for repaving the roads. According to the report, he had been found lying in the middle of the street late one night. No signs of injury, no explanation for why he was there. Just like the others. Whitaker, Ethan muttered. I've seen that name before. Martha frowned. Dale Whitaker. He was a farmer who collapsed in the same spot back in 1952. He survived, but he was never the same after that. Ethan leaned back in his chair. This isn't a coincidence. Vivian wasn't the first person connected to that road. Something's been happening there for a long time, and it started when the cemetery was disturbed. Martha was silent for a moment before she said, Ethan, I think whatever was left behind when they built over that cemetery, it was never meant to be disturbed. And if it's still there, it might not be done. A chill ran through him. Ranger still won't cross that road, even now. Maybe Vivian found peace, but whatever else is there, it's not gone. Martha closed the book in front of her. Then you need to decide what you're going to do next. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on him. He had thought this was over, that finding Vivian had been the end of it. But the past wasn't finished yet, and neither was he.